Thank you so much for your warm welcome. Thank you all of the preceding speakers for essentially setting the stage for some of the ideas that I would like to convey to you here today. As you know, I am very interested in the future, and I have to agree with the theme of this gathering here, that the future hinges on the oceans, really, really importantly so. We came from the ocean, all life came from the ocean, but now as we look towards the future, I don't think we can possibly sustain life on this planet unless we think about the role that the oceans play from the point of view of feeding the population, securing all sorts of natural resources, including energy, and more importantly, regulating climate in the world. One of my colleagues at my previous university in the United States was a geophysicist, and she always emphasized how important it is to pay attention to the oceans when it comes to thinking about global warming. Because the oceans absorb radiation, they absorb temperature. So the role of the oceans goes well beyond just the popular sense that we need to worry about the sea levels. So today I would like to essentially in the next few minutes tell you a little bit about how three things interact with one another and how they, I think, will help us understand the future and the role that the oceans will play in that future. So the first is population. The second one is consumption and the economy. And I will talk there about the rise of the middle class. And the third is cities. And I would like to especially emphasize here today the role of cities in the sense that it is really important for your city, for Busan, to think about the role that it can play in this rapidly evolving world. So I would like, as I just mentioned, to first tell you a little bit about what's going on with population trends in the world. Second, a little bit about the growth of the middle class and how that is accelerating consumption. And whenever we see consumption increase in the world, then we also see pressure on natural resources, including the oceans, of course. I want to next tell you a little bit about the growth of cities and how that is likely to impact oceans. And also tell you a little bit, when you put all of those things together, what are some of the options that we have available to us in terms of making humanity more sustainable? And lastly, as I said, I want to tell you a little bit about cities as hubs. The mayor of Busan spoke very vividly about the fact that your city can become a global hub, or at least a regional hub for Northeast Asia. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about what's going on with population. So, as you know, we have 7.5 billion American billions, or 7,500 million people, give or take, in the world. And the United Nations itself comes up every year with 16 different scenarios or projections about the future. Here you see 4 of them. I like these 4 because they give us a sense as to what is the maximum and what is perhaps the most likely path in the future. And first, let me bring to your attention the fact that each of these scenarios give us a very different population, human population on Earth by the year 2100. The one at the top, 22,000 million people. The one at the bottom, just 6 or 6.5. So they couldn't be more different. So the one at the top says constant fertility. What that means is that if we continue to have the same fertility rate, number of babies per woman in the world that we have today, and we keep mortality at the same level, then we will get to that number over there. Now, I consider that to be the maximum. Why? Well, because we know that the number of babies is dropping, and in a moment I will tell you more about that. So I think that if we were to vote here I'm sure that you would tell me that this is probably the least likely, the least probable of the 4 scenarios. And then the other 3, they are labeled as high, medium, and low. And you can imagine then that whenever a forecasting service, whenever an international agency such as the United Nations labels 3 future scenarios as high, medium, and low, they are communicating to us that they believe that the medium is the most likely path. So the medium, as you can see, is very different from the high and from the low. The medium, what we see is that population continues to grow up until maybe about the year 2090 or so in the world. But it grows at a decreasing rate. It grows more slowly over time, okay? Now the high has population growing at a steady rate. And the low, as you can see, has the global population peaking in about 25 or 30 years from now, and then declining. So once again, the most likely scenario is the medium one. But you can get a sense of the range of possibilities if you change either the fertility rate, the number of babies, or you change the mortality, just as what has happened now with the pandemic, or perhaps you change both. So I'm going to assume that the medium that you see over here is the most likely, the scenario with the highest probability into the future. Well, that still means that by the year 2100, we're going to have perhaps 3,000 million more people to feed in the world. And that is a very large number. So the pressure on resources will increase. As I told you earlier, the reason why I believe, like the United Nations does, that this is the most likely scenario is that, as you can see over here, total fertility, the number of babies that each woman has on average, estimated over her lifetime, has been declining for the last 40 or 50 years. It has declined in the more developed parts of the world. It has declined in the emerging markets, the less developed, especially here in Asia. It has also declined in the least developed parts of the world. That's Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, and parts of South Asia. So it has been declining all along, since more or less the year 1980 or so globally. And today, of course, we are in the year 2021. And as you can see, the projection, the forecast, is that the number will continue to drop in the poorest parts of the world, that's the dotted line, and it will also drop in the emerging markets. But I want to bring to your attention something that is somewhat surprising about this chart. The line at the bottom, this is the developed world. This is the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Japan, now also South Korea. As you can see, there is a slight increase beginning in the year 2000, which is surprising because, once again, the general trend is that this number is dropping everywhere in the world. So what is going on? Well, this increase that you see over here, very, very small increase, has been happening primarily in some European countries and also in the United States. And the biggest factor behind it is immigration. Why? Well, because immigrant families tend to have more children than local families in the host country, in the destination country. And so we've seen over the last 20 years, since the year 2000, roughly speaking, that slight increase. You will see in a moment that that has implications. But the other side of the coin in every discussion about population is life expectancy. We want to know not only how many babies will be born, we also want to know how long those babies are expected to live on average. So here we have the same chart as before in terms of the time scale. We begin in 1950, we go to 2020 with actual data, the rest are forecasts into the future. Vertically now we're measuring the number of years that a baby born, let's say, in 1990, would be expected to live, depending on whether that baby was born in the more developed parts of the world or in the less developed or the least developed parts of the world. And as you can see, the trend is very clear. I have very good news to report. I cannot make any promises to any one of you in particular, but on average, we will live maybe 5 or 6 years longer than our parents and 11 years longer than our grandparents. So once again, don't run to the bank with that information, because it may or may not apply to you. But on average, that is what's going to happen. Well, but there's once again another very important thing going on this chart, which is that if you compare 1950 to today, the difference between a baby born in a rich country and a baby born in a poor country has become smaller, has shrunk. There has been convergence over time. So in other words, every baby in the world, all babies, are seeing their life expectancy grow on average. But babies born in the poorer parts of the world are seeing their life expectancy grow faster. In other words, the poorer countries are catching up with the rich countries in terms of life expectancy. So if we have, as I just showed you, forecasts about fertility, the number of babies, and also about how long those babies will live, then we can calculate the size of populations in the future. The only thing that we need to do is to hold migration constant. Now, when I first drew on my computer the chart that I'm about to show you, I could not believe my eyes. I thought I had made a mistake. That's the chart with the most recently available data. But it's based, once again, on the number of babies and on how long those babies are expected to live. We begin in 1950 on the left. We go to the year 2020 with actual data, and then the rest are forecasts. I drew a vertical line in the year 2028. That's because in the year 2028, as you can see, several of the curves cross each other. Now, before the pandemic, those curves were crossing in the year 2030. And that's why I called the book 2030. But the pandemic, as one of the speakers was mentioning, has accelerated everything. This is not a pandemic that has derailed change. It's a pandemic that is accelerating change. And so look, by the year 2028, in just 7 years from today, just 7 years, South Central Asia, which includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, will have reached a maximum as a percentage of the world's population, a maximum. Also in the year 2028, Africa will have become bigger than East Asia. East Asia, of course, includes Korea, China, Japan, Vietnam, and so on. For the first time. Also that year, the part of the world where I come from, Europe, will fall to place number 5 or number 6. And let's not forget, in 1950, Europe was the second biggest region by population after East Asia. So from 2nd to 5th or 6th. So this is going to change quite a few things in the world. Of course, it's going to change the geopolitical balance of power. It's going to change the economy. And as we shall see in a moment, it's also going to change the internal makeup of each of these countries, all of these changes here. Now, you just saw on the chart the phenomenal increase in Africa's population. By the way, Africa is the part of the world that has still the most people living relatively far away from the oceans. But that is changing very fast. There's a lot of migration in Africa from the interior towards the coastal areas, as we shall see later. So Africa is a very large part of the world. Look at all of the countries that fit into the African continent. So even with all of that population growth, Africa will never be as densely populated per square kilometer or square mile as some other regions in the world. But you see, that's not what really matters, the number of people. What really matters for our debate here as to the future of the oceans is how much are those people consuming? What is the purchasing power of those people? And here I want to focus your attention on the middle class. Because unlike people below the poverty line, the middle class doesn't want a bicycle, they want a car. They want air conditioning in their home. By the way, they want a permanent residence, but maybe also a vacation home. They like to travel, and so on and so forth. And as you very well know, what's going on is that as we speak today, as a percentage of the total, still the European Union and the United States are relatively big in terms of the purchasing power of the middle class. But by the year 2030, in just 9 years from now, China and India, and then if you add to that the rest of Asia, including South Korea, but excluding Japan, you get already more than half. So things are going to change very quickly. But there's also something really important about this chart that I want to bring to your attention. If instead of stopping the calculations in the year 2030, we continue until the year 2040, or even the year 2050, following the same methodology, we find something really important, which is that India eventually becomes, roughly speaking, by the year 2040, the country with the largest middle class measured by purchasing power in the world, becoming bigger than China. You see, I frequently make this presentation to an audience from China. And you know what they tell me? When I show them this, they tell me, "Professor, you're wrong." They tell me, "You have to be wrong. You have to have made a mistake." Because they tell me China is going to be #1 at everything. What are you talking about? And I push back and I tell them, I think China is going to have the largest economy. Because remember, the economy is not just consumption, it's also investment and exports, right? So the economy is exports plus investment plus domestic consumption. Here we're talking about the bulk of domestic consumption, the purchasing power of the middle class. Why is India going to have an even bigger middle class by purchasing power than China by the year 2040 or so? Very simple. They're having more babies today. And that means two things. Number one, they're going to have a bigger population. Number two, they're going to have a younger population. And let's not forget, young people are the ones who purchase homes, who purchase automobiles, who purchase appliances for the home, and so on and so forth. All of those things, by the way, that the Korean economy makes in very, very great amounts. So India will become the biggest market. So what is the consequence of all of this? Well, the consequence of all of this, if you focus your attention just on the bottom line, this is measured in billions of US dollars, American billions, so thousands of millions, right? Well, global consumption is going to grow dramatically from 39 to 63, nearly 64 thousands of millions. We're going to have more consumption in the world, not only because we're going to have a slightly bigger population, and remember, population growth is slowing down, but primarily because of the growth of the middle class, right? Because middle class consumption is growing. So this is where, you know, although I am normally a very optimistic person, I actually believe that in most of these changes that I've been telling you about, there is room for optimism. There's something that I'm very concerned about. When you compare the year 1973, so before the full consequences of the first oil shock were felt, and the year 2019, so these data come from the International Energy Agency, you will see that total energy supply by source in the world hasn't changed much, okay? So we still have natural gas and oil, two fossil fuels, okay, accounting for, roughly speaking, the same amount. What has happened is that oil has receded from 46% to 30%, but natural gas has expanded from 16 to 23. So that's better because natural gas is more environmentally friendly. But we're still talking about fossil fuels. And look at coal. Coal, which is the dirtiest way of providing for heat or generating electricity and so on, has actually increased from 24.7 to 26.8%. And the other category, that includes wind and solar and all of that. So I'm very much looking forward to the presentation by the ambassador to tell us what is the potential of wind, because we really need to do something about this distribution. But once again, the more worrying part is what you see at the bottom. How much energy are we consuming in the world? So we've gone from 254 EJs to 606, more than twice as much, because obviously the population has grown, but also the middle class has grown. So when compared to 1973, we are actually consuming nearly 3 times as much coal as we were consuming or burning back in 1973. Because the proportion of coal has remained about the same, but the total amount of energy that we're using in the world has grown by nearly 3 times. Now, there are so many other things that I would like to tell you. For example, that another big consequence of the changes in population that I've been telling you about is that we're going to see changes in the age distribution of the population. And this is something that I think we all need to take into consideration very carefully. Here what you have is how many millions there will be between the ages of 15 and 35 in the year 2020 and then in the year 2030. And as you can see in the table with the largest countries, there are 3 types of countries. Countries like India or Nigeria are going to have even more people in that age group. But others like the United States are going to have, roughly speaking, the same number. But here's the catch. What's going to change in the US is the composition of this age group by the year 2030. The US Census Bureau of the US government predicts that by the year 2030, more than half of the people between the ages of 15 and 35 will be what today we call minorities: African Americans, Latins, Asian Americans, and so on. So in other words, the minorities are going to be the majority. In case you're wondering why American politics is changing so much, that's the reason. The reason is that in this younger age group, these people will vote in the year 2030, these 89.5 million people. For the first time in history, the minorities are going to be the majorities, right? The minorities combined, of course. And then we're going to have other countries that are going to see a decline, like China, Japan, Brazil, also South Korea, by the way, in this case by 3 million people. And then we're going to have, at the other end of the age distribution, a massive increase in the number of people above the age of 60. And here, once again, you see the number in millions in the year 2020 and the number in millions in the year 2030. So this is also going to change things in ways that I'm going to show you in a moment. The most important one, talking about sustainability. How sustainable is it that we're going to get into a situation, especially in Japan, as you can see over here, where you're going to have 1.5 people of working age for each person above the age of 60. Really hard, right? Unless we have a lot of technological change, unless we come up with new financing structures, it's going to be very difficult. And every country in the world, including South Korea, look at how quickly the ratio is coming down for South Korea, is going to go through this change, right? Even a country like Nigeria in Africa eventually will also fall. Now, let me turn to cities. So what is important to know about cities? Cities represent only 1% of the land area in the world. But they are home to now 60%, in a few years, 65% of the population. And cities are the source of 80% of the carbon emissions. Now, COVID-19 may make cities less attractive because of social distancing and remote work. But still, we're going to see a lot of growth in cities, especially in Africa and South Asia. Look at a map in the world in 1970. Only 3 cities with more than 10 million people: New York, Tokyo, and Osaka. Only 3. By 1990, now you have Seoul, you have Mumbai and Kolkata, you have 4 cities in Latin America and also LA. But still, in 1990, no city in China with more than 10 million people, or in Africa, or in the Middle East. Now, 2 years ago, that was a situation. Tremendous growth of cities in Africa and Southeast Asia, in India, the Middle East, and in Africa. And look at the map. Most of that growth very close to the ocean or on the ocean. And here's the projection to the year 2030. And like 50 years ago, we're going to have 35 cities with more than 10 million people. And we're going to have altogether 450 cities with more than 1 million people, which is all of the dots that you see over there. We're going to have possibly 60 to 70% of the world's population living in cities close to the oceans, and that, by the way, is where most of the consumption takes place. So once again, oceans. I worry about the location of cities. We should try to provide incentives for cities to grow, not only right here in the ocean, but also in the interior. We should pay attention to the role that the oceans play in regulating climate change, okay? And then the other big thing, which I think is going to change Busan probably. If global warming makes the Arctic open to navigation, as you know, around the year-round, that's going to change the global economy in terms of trade among North America, Europe, and Northeast Asia. And of course, I think it will be tragic, but at the same time, it will create a lot of opportunities. And we kind of see Busan here on the map for cities, for ports, for harbors that can play a role in this exchange. My last 3 minutes. The mayor of Busan was telling you at the beginning that he has a plan. His administration has a plan for turning Busan into a global city, or at least into a regional hub. And let me just give you a definition of what a global city is. A global city is a city whose importance and identity transcends, goes beyond the country in which it is situated. It is the place where the work of globalization gets done, right? Globalization works because we have cities that contribute to it. And there are several very important dimensions to it: the economy, finance, politics, culture, diversity. So what are the common features of global cities? Well, they tend to be large, influential, prominent. The truly global cities, they tend to be culturally and ethnically diverse, so immigration plays a role. Culturally, they are very dynamic. They thrive on culture: museums, music, universities, schools. They have advanced infrastructure. So I was here in Busan 20 years ago, and I can tell that the infrastructure now is absolutely world-class when compared to 20 years ago. Global cities are also rich in business services like consulting, technology, all of those things. And they have to be open, friendly, and safe. And of course, legally and politically secure. So those are the features of global cities. The drivers of global cities are agglomeration economies. So when people are closely located, they can get work done much faster. You see the growth of specialized service firms, the coordination of dispersed activities, and of course the role of new communications technologies. I would argue that right now in the world we only have two truly global hubs. Global, London and New York. But there are regional hubs like Singapore, like Panama, like Miami, like Dubai. And I personally see it perfectly possible for Busan to become a regional hub. Then you have another category, gateways. People used to argue that Hong Kong was a gateway to China. Now things are changing. People still argue that Sydney is a hub to Australia and the Pacific region. So I would like you to consider all of these things, but also in closing, to consider something really important that may change cities in the near future, which is what we've learned during this pandemic regarding remote work. I don't want to bore you with the pros and the cons, with the advantages and the disadvantages of remote work. But I do want to bring to your attention that I think that this new era that has begun now with remote work, I think is going to create more offshoring in the world. I think remote work enables companies to hire employees worldwide without restrictions, and also enables employees to search for jobs worldwide. So I think we're witnessing the beginning of a global market for talent. And I think cities will play a very important role there. So if Busan wants to succeed, make sure that people would like to be here, but work remotely for companies established worldwide, which is, in a way, what some other cities in the world have accomplished, such as Singapore. So thank you so much for your attention, and once again, remember that when thinking about the future of oceans, we need to think about the future of population, and we also need to think about the future of the middle class. Thank you so much for your attention.